The Bitterroot Mountains, winter of 1,879, snow driving sideways, and hoofbeats closing in behind her. The door opened. The man with the rifle looked straight past her to the tree line. Gun stayed up. She didn't step back. "My name is Eliza Whitcomb. I have a marriage contract with Samuel Calder. No Samuel Calder lives here." The youngest one glanced around the single room and said it like a warning. "There's only one bed." The hoofbeats were close now. Eliza looked at the fire, at three strangers who hadn't asked her for anything yet. She stepped inside. She didn't know she'd just walked into the secret that got their father killed, and a fight only she could finish. Settle in. The story starts now. The snow came sideways. Eliza Whitcomb had been walking for 2 hours through that kind of cold, and she still could not decide which was worse, the wind off the ridge or the knowledge that the men with lanterns were still behind her. She didn't look back. Looking back cost steps, and steps were the only currency she had left. Her right boot had torn along the sole, somewhere past the second creek crossing. She could feel the wet seeping in with every footfall, the cold working up through her ankle like it intended to stay. Her left hand bled where she'd grabbed a pine branch too hard, pulling herself up a slope. She hadn't noticed until the blood froze. In her coat pocket, folded in quarters and beginning to soften from the sweat of her palm, was a marriage contract. It named a man called Samuel Calder. It promised a homestead, a Christian household, a husband of good character. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. The lanterns below the ridge dipped and steadied. They were taking their time. They knew the mountain she did not. Eliza pressed on. The cabin appeared through the trees, the way things appear in bad weather, suddenly, and all at once. A low roof, carrying 3 feet of snow, a wood smoke thread climbing from a stone chimney, one window with firelight behind it, orange and alive, and so ordinary it nearly made her stop breathing. She crossed the last open ground at something faster than a walk, her boot slapping with each stride. She reached the door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. The cold had taken most of the feeling in her knuckles, so she used the side of her fist. The door opened. The man holding the rifle was tall enough that he had to angle his shoulder to stand in the frame. Dark hair, several days of beard eyes, that moved from her face to the tree line behind her before they came back. He did not lower the gun. Eliza stood her ground. She'd learned in the last 3 days that the moment you stepped back from someone, they started making decisions for you. "My name is Eliza Whitcomb," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I have a contract with a man called Samuel Calder. I was told he lives here." The man studied her. His jaw worked once, like he was sorting through several responses and setting them aside. "No, Samuel Calder lives here," he said. Behind him, the cabin was one room. A fire, a wood stove, a narrow bed along the far wall, blankets piled high, a work table covered in tools and lamp parts. 2 other men, one crouching by the stove, one half-risen from a stool, both watching her with the particular stillness of people deciding whether a situation was dangerous. "I was brought west by the Western Domestic Placement Society," she said, "on a freight wagon. I have documentation." She pulled the contract from her pocket with her uninjured hand, held it out. "I'm not asking to stay permanently. I need shelter for one night." The man at the stove stood fully. He was lean, with watchful eyes, and the kind of quiet that made you feel like he'd already noticed 3 things about you before you'd opened your mouth. He looked at her hand, the bleeding one. "How long have you been out in that?" he asked. 2 hours, approximately." He glanced at the man with the rifle. Some kind of shorthand passed between them. The third man, younger, with a smear of lamp oil across his jaw and an expression that hadn't yet settled into suspicion, had moved to the window. He pushed the shutter open an inch and peered into the dark. "Silas," he said quietly. The man with the rifle. Silas looked over riders. "Maybe 4, coming up the logging trace." Silas's eyes came back to Eliza. She watched him, Calculate. She knew what it looked like when someone was deciding whether she was a threat or someone else's trap. She'd seen that face on the freight wagon captain, on the placement agent in St. Louis, on the foreman in Mercy Hollow, who had looked at her like she was cargo with legs. "You said you need one night," Silas said. "Yes. Who are those men?" "They work for the freight company that transported me." She held his gaze. "I left before they wanted me to." The man from the stove walked toward her slowly, stopping a few feet back. He tilted his head. "Can I look at your hand?" She blinked. Most men didn't ask. "Yes," she said. He took her wrist with a careful, impersonal grip, turned her palm toward the firelight. Frostbite starting on the fingers. "Cuts not deep." He released her. "Your right foot's wet through. The boot tore. I can see that." The younger one had turned from the window. He looked at the space between Eliza and the bed, then at his brothers, then at the ceiling, in a way that suggested he was doing rapid calculations of his own. "There's only one bed," he said. He said it like a warning and an apology at the same time. From below the ridge came the sound of hooves. More than 4 now, or the echo of 4 made to sound like more by the cold in the trees. Eliza heard it. She looked at the door. She looked at the 3 brothers, at the fire, at the single bed with its pile of blankets. She stepped inside. Silas shut the door behind her and dropped the bar across it. No one spoke for a moment. Then the younger one moved to the work table and started quietly shifting tools. The man from the stove, Jonah, she would learn, went to the fire and added wood. Silas stood at the window, with the shutter cracked a half-inch, watching the dark. "Silas," Jonah said, "I see them. There are 2 options. We answer the door when they knock, or we don't." "I'm aware." Eliza stood in the middle of the room. Her wet boot was making a small puddle on the dirt floor. She was shaking now, not from fear exactly, but from the cold leaving her body, and her body not quite knowing what to do with the absence. Jonah pulled a stool near the stove without making a production of it. He didn't tell her to sit. He set it there and walked away. She sat. The warmth hit her like something physical. She pressed her hands toward it and watched Silas at the window. "The contract," he said, without turning. "Who issued it?" "The Western Domestic Placement Society, based in St. Louis." The agent's name was Hargrove, and you'd never heard of Samuel Calder before they sent you west. Never, but they had his name, this address. "They had a name," she said. "I'm beginning to think the address was more accurate than the man." The younger one looked up from the work table. "I'm Micah," he said, in case nobody was going to say it. He nodded toward the man at the stove. "That's Jonah. Stone pillar by the window is Silas, Eliza Whitcomb. You said that part." He wasn't being unkind. He had that quality some people had, of using lightness like a tool, offering it carefully to see if it helped. It helped a little. Outside, the horses had stopped. She could hear men talking in low voices, further down than she'd expected, still on the lower trail. Not yet at the cabin. Silas turned from the window. He looked at Eliza with something she was coming to recognize as his default expression. Measuring, not hostile, like a man who made decisions based on evidence and was still collecting it. "You said you left before they wanted you to," he said. "What were they taking you to?" "A mining settlement. The placement agent told me it was a farmstead." She paused. "There was another girl on the wagon, younger than me. She told me what the settlement actually was." Jonah had gone still. "I need you to understand something," Eliza said. She looked at all 3 of them. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not frightened. I am. But I am not helpless, and I am not confused, and I did not come to your door because I had nowhere else to go." She stopped. "I came because the lanterns were getting closer, and your window had firelight. Those were the facts available to me." Micah was watching her with his head tilted. Silas crossed to the table and set his rifle down. Not because he'd decided she was safe, she thought, but because he'd decided the rifle wasn't necessary in this particular conversation. "You'll take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep at the door. Jonah's by the stove. Micah keeps the work table." "I won't take your bed. You're not taking it. We're giving it." She started to argue. Jonah spoke first. Quiet and matter-of-fact, your core temperature is dropping. This isn't generosity. It's practical. Eliza looked at the bed. She looked at the contract still in her hand. She set it on the work table without knowing quite why, and Micah glanced at the seal stamped in the lower corner. He didn't say anything, but something changed in his face, some ease going out of it. She filed that away. Outside, the hoofbeats had started again, closer now. Jonah crouched beside her stool. Your foot? Can I look at it properly? Yes. He worked carefully, the same way he'd looked at her hand, thorough, unhurried, and without making her feel like a problem being solved. When he found the torn sole, he made a small sound. Not distress, just noting. We have dry socks, Micah offered, and I can patch the boot by morning. I patch everything. Silas said nothing. He stood by the door, with his hand near, but not on the rifle, listening to horses pick their way up through the snow. Eliza sat by the fire and let the warmth reach her bones and thought, they gave her the bed, they're sleeping on the floor, and not one of them has asked her for anything in return. It wasn't enough to trust them. Not yet. But it was enough to stay. The fire came through the window as a bottle. It hit the shutter, shattered, and the burning oil spread across the floor in a wide orange fan. Eliza was on her feet before she understood what she was seeing. Smoke came fast. That was the thing no one told you about fire. In a small space, it wasn't the flames that moved first. It was the smoke, low and purposeful, like it had been waiting. Get down, Silas said. He wasn't shouting. He said it the way you'd say, watch your step. Eliza dropped to her knees and pulled her coat over her face. Through the gap beneath it, she could see Micah already at the water barrel, soaking blankets. Not fumbling, moving like someone who had rehearsed this, or something close to it. She looked at the ammunition chest on the shelf above the fireplace. Then she looked at the fire, spreading toward the far wall, and she did the calculation herself. She grabbed the 2 wet blankets Micah shoved at her, without a word. She threw one across the floor in front of the chest and pressed it down flat, then draped the second over the chest itself and held it there, both hands flat against the cloth, the heat coming through. Good, Micah said beside her. He didn't sound surprised. Silas was at the back wall. He pulled a knotted rope from a hook, crouched, and pressed on a section of the floorboards. A narrow trap opened. The smell that came up was dirt and cold and old pine. Chest first, he said, then everyone. Jonah took one handle, Micah the other. Eliza held the blankets in place until the last possible moment, then let go and went through the opening on her hands and knees behind Micah. Silas came last. He pulled the trap shut above him. The passage was low enough that she had to duck walk, and tight enough that her shoulders brushed both walls. Silas moved ahead of her with a small lantern he'd somehow had in his coat pocket, and the light threw uneven shadows along the dirt walls. Behind her, she could hear, muffled and distant, the fire taking whatever it wanted. She thought about the bed, the dry socks Micah had given her, small things that had been briefly kind. Then she stopped thinking about it and focused on the back of Micah's boots. The passage opened into a low earthen chamber beneath the woodshed. From there, a wooden door, swollen with cold, led out the far side of the hill. Silas hit it with his shoulder twice. It opened onto dark trees and silence, and snow coming down steadily. No riders visible. Eliza stood still and listened. Nothing but wind. There's a trapping station, Silas said, 1/4 mile northeast. It hasn't been used in 2 seasons, but it'll hold. Nobody argued. They walked. The station was small, 2 rooms, a rusted stove, shutters that needed coaxing. But the roof was sound, and there was dry wood stacked under an oilcloth lean-to outside, which Micah called a miracle, and Jonah called adequate planning by whoever had used it last. Silas built the fire without being asked. Jonah went through the supply pack he'd carried out of the passage with a systematic focus that suggested he'd been quietly cataloging it since they left. Eliza stood in the center of the main room and watched them work. She recognized what she was doing. She was measuring exits, counting windows, noting who stood where. Old habit, grown fast. 3 days on that wagon had installed it. The station has 2 rooms, Silas said, without looking up from the stove. You take the inner one. Door has a bar. You use it or you don't. That's your choice, but it's there. I heard you. I'm saying it plainly, because I want there to be no question. He sat back on his heels and looked at her then. You're here because men outside your wagon wanted to hand you to someone who didn't deserve you. That's the whole of it. We're not owed anything for the roof. She considered him. Most men who say they're not owed anything follow it up by listing what they expect. I'm not most men, so you say, so I've said. He turned back to the stove. You'll know if I'm lying soon enough. Jonah set the pack on the table and looked up. She has a point, he said pleasantly, about the pattern. Jonah, I'm agreeing with you, in a roundabout way. Micah had his head in the supply pack. He surfaced holding a wool coat 2 sizes too large, shook it out, set it on the table. You can borrow that. It's mine. So it's a loan, not a gift. You can give it back when you don't need it anymore. He paused. Or keep it. I'll pretend I forgot. Eliza looked at the coat, at Micah, at his entirely earnest face. She picked it up. Thank you, she said. It came out a little rough. She hadn't used those words in several days, and they'd gotten stiff. Jonah had spread the marriage contract on the table. He was bent over it with the lantern close, reading slowly. She watched his face. These dates are wrong, he said. I noticed. The placement contract is dated November 3rd. The travel authorization is dated October 28th. He looked up. You can't sign the authorization before the contract that requires it. I know. So this was assembled. Not issued, yes. Silas had turned to listen. Micah had gone still. Someone put this together out of parts, Jonah said. Different documents, different sources, printed to look official. He tapped the seal at the bottom. This mark, I've seen it before. Silas crossed the room and looked. Something shifted in his expression, and Eliza caught it a tightening, brief but real, before it went away. Where have you seen it? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the chest they'd carried out. The old wooden one with the iron clasp, the one she'd grabbed from the shelf before going through the passage. She hadn't thought about it in the moment. She'd seen it near the fire and picked it up. She understood now, looking at his face, that it mattered to him more than he was going to say. That's your father's, she said. It was. I'm sorry. I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was near the fire. He was quiet for a moment. You saved it. I'm not complaining. He opened it. Inside, folded papers, a small compass, a hand-drawn map of the mountain range with markings she didn't recognize, and a strip of cloth with faded writing along the edge. Jonah came to look. He kept this in the cabin all this time? I never opened it after he died. Felt like it needed a reason. Silas set his hand flat on the edge of the chest and looked at the map. The markings were small, careful, made by someone who knew how to record detail without wasting ink. Eliza looked at them too. Something about the symbols at the trail junctions looked familiar. She didn't say it yet. She filed it away and kept looking. The men who followed me, she said, the younger one, on the gray horse. Before I left the wagon, I heard one of the others call him Ferris. Micah looked up from the corner where he'd been sorting through a box of trapping supplies. Porter Ferris? I don't know the first name. Tall, yellow coat. Yes. Micah sat back. He works for Vale Mountain Freight. I've seen him at the Mercy Hollow Depot twice this year. He said it evenly, but something underneath it wasn't even at all. Silas, said Vale. It wasn't a question. I haven't said anything about Vale, Eliza said carefully. You didn't need to. Silas folded the map and set it back in the chest. Porter Ferris doesn't work for anyone else. Jonah returned to the contract. He read it again slowly. Eliza watched him, then made a decision. There's something you should know, she said. I didn't leave that wagon alone. She had their attention. There was a girl, 14 years old. Her name is Nell. She was told she was going to work as a kitchen assistant at a lodging house. Eliza looked at her hands. She wasn't going to a lodging house. She knew it by the second day. She gave me something before I ran, pressed it into my hand. In the dark. She paused. I promised her I'd come back. No one spoke. She reached down to the hem of her dress. She'd sewn it herself, 2 days before leaving Missouri, in a small room with a borrowed needle. She worked the stitches loose at the inside edge, found the folded paper, and drew it out. She set it on the table. It was a sheet of hymn music, printed, with handwritten markings throughout. It looked ordinary. To someone who didn't read music, it probably looked like a choir annotation. Eliza smoothed it with her palm. "I haven't told you everything," she said. "I'm telling you now." Silas looked at the sheet. At her. "What is it?" "I don't fully know yet, but the markings don't match the music." She pointed without touching. "This rest is in the wrong place for the meter. This note doesn't belong in this key. And these numbers, written in the margin, they're not verse numbers. Verse numbers, in a hymnal, that's 6 or 7. These go to 43. Jonah leaned in close. Micah was already at the table, looking over her shoulder. "So someone hid something in the music?" "Yes. And a 14-year-old girl gave this to you and told you to run." "Yes. He was quiet for a beat. That's a brave kid." "She is," Eliza said, "which is why I'm not leaving these mountains until I know where they took her." Silas said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the map in the chest. He looked at the hymn sheet. He looked at the seal on the fraudulent contract. Then he said, 3 days she waited. 3 days to investigate before we make any decision about moving toward Mercy Hollow. You work with us, not for us. You tell us what you know when you know it. He met her eyes, and we do the same. Agreed, Eliza said. Micah went to the window to check the shutters. He pushed one open a crack, looked out, and went very still. Silas. What? There's a red cloth. Outside the left shutter, tied to the sill. Nobody moved for a second. Vale's men use red cloth to mark a location, Micah said. I've seen it at the freight stations. Means they've identified a target point. He turned around. His voice was steady, but his face wasn't quite. They know we're here. By morning the red cloth was gone. Whether someone had removed it or the wind had, none of them could say. Eliza had slept for 4 hours. She knew it was 4, because the small clock on the station shelf had been working when she arrived, and she'd watched its hands twice before closing her eyes. Old habit from a life where she'd had to track her hours, because no one else was going to track them for her. She woke before the others and sat at the table with the hymn sheet. She had her tuning fork in her coat pocket. She always had it. It had been her mother's, passed down at a moment too painful to think about in the dark, and she'd carried it so long that its absence would have felt like losing a finger. She took it out and struck it softly against her thumbnail. The tone rang quiet and clear in the cold room. She held it beside the first line of the hymn and began working through the melody. By the time Jonah woke and added wood to the stove, she'd found the 3rd false note. By the time Micah came in stamping snow off his boots, with news that the path northeast was clear, she'd found a 9. By the time Silas came in from his watch without a word and poured himself coffee from the pot Jonah had made, she had them laid out in a pattern she could almost read. The pitches mark locations, she said. When she said it aloud, it sounded simple, and she supposed it was once you saw it. Each wrong note corresponds to a specific tone. I've been mapping them against the hand signals Nell showed me. She spread the hymn sheet flat on the table. She knew more than she let on. She'd been watching them for weeks. Jonah sat across from her. He studied the page. These marks beside certain notes. He pointed. I recognized those. Medical notation. Specifically the old military kind. What do they indicate? He was quiet for a moment. Status markers. Whether a patient was stable, critical, or he stopped. Whether they made it. The room was very still. Rests, Eliza said quietly. The rests represent women who didn't survive the transport or disappeared after arrival. Jonah nodded once. He didn't look away from the page. Silas had not sat. He stood at the window with his coffee, his back to the room. How many rests? Eliza looked at the sheet. 11, in this copy. Nobody said anything, for a while. Micah broke the silence, because that was what Micah did. The verse numbers go to 43. Are those dates? Dates, or transport numbers? Maybe both. Eliza traced one of the margin notations. The numbers are too large for standard verse labeling, And they're grouped in clusters, 6 or 7 at a time, then a gap, then another group. I think the clusters are convoys. Silas turned from the window. How did Nell get this copy? She didn't say, and I didn't ask. There wasn't time. Eliza folded her hands on the table, but she knew what it was. She said to me, "Give this to someone who can read it and isn't afraid of what it says." Those were her words. Micah was looking at the far wall. Then he straightened. The signal tower. What? Black Pine Signal Tower. It's been abandoned for 6 years. 7, maybe. But I've been up there twice, and there's an equipment cabinet inside. He looked at the others. I saw markings on it that I couldn't explain at the time. I thought it was kids messing around. He paused. I don't think that anymore. Silas set down his coffee. How far? 20 minutes if the path is clear. 30 in this snow. Show us. The tower stood at the tree line where the mountain shoulder leveled before dropping away into the valley. It was taller than it looked from below, maybe 40 feet. Built from larch trunks and iron bolts, with a signal platform at the top and a small enclosed room at the base for the equipment. Micah had the door open in under a minute with a piece of wire from his coat. He was good with locks. He made no comment on this fact, and neither did anyone else. Inside was dusty and cold and smelled of iron and old rope. Shelving along one wall, a broken lantern housing, 2 signal bells coated in cobwebs, and the equipment cabinet, taller than a man, its iron face patterned with dents from weather and time. And on the right panel, scratched carefully into the metal, a series of small marks. Eliza raised her lantern. The marks were in the same notation as the hymn sheet, grouped by pitch, margin numbers, the medical symbols, beside several entries. It's the same hand, she said. Whoever made the markings on this sheet came through this tower, or was kept nearby, Jonah said. Eliza looked along the bottom row of marks. She went very still. What? Silas said. She pointed. 2 letters, scratched smaller than the rest, as if the person doing it had wanted to be careful. N.H. Nell Harper, she said. Nobody made her repeat it. Micah was already examining the signal bells with a careful hand, brushing away the cobwebs and tilting one to look at the clapper mechanism. He tested the housing with his thumb, pressed on the bracket, checked the line connections. This one's salvageable, he said. Brackets bent and the lines corroded, but the bell itself is intact. He looked up. Give me an hour. Silas looked at Eliza. It was the first time she'd noticed him ask with his eyes before his mouth. Can you cross-reference those tower markings with the hymn sheet, he said. Already started. She sat on a crate near the door and began working. The tuning fork helped she could match pitches from the sheet to the carved marks by sound and position. Building a key that translated notation into something she could plot against the maps in the Calder father's chest. Jonah sat nearby and read over her shoulder without crowding her. He asked a question once. She answered it. He nodded and didn't ask again until she'd finished that section. Outside, the snow had slowed. The valley below the tower was white and enormous and completely quiet. An hour passed. Micah made a sound of frustration, then a sound of satisfaction, then silence. Then a clear tone rang out across the valley. It wasn't loud, but it carried. A long, pure bell sound that moved through the cold air and lifted into the trees and rolled down toward the river below. And for a moment, Eliza forgot what she was holding in her hands. Micah appeared in the doorway, with his hands black from the corroded line. He was grinning. Eliza laughed. She didn't plan it. It came out of her the way things come out, when you've been held tight for too long, sudden, real, and a little surprised at itself. Silas turned from the window and looked at her. She stopped, almost, then didn't. Micah's expression shifted into something quieter and more pleased, as if the laugh mattered more than the bell. Jonah handed her a piece of dried meat from his pocket, without comment, which was its own kind of tenderness. The convoy, Eliza said, when she found her composure. She spread the decoded notations on the crate. If these date clusters represent transport windows, the next one is here. She pointed to a cluster at the bottom of the sheet, with a location mark that corresponded to a mountain pass on Silas's father's map. 9 days, through Black Pine Pass. Silas looked at the mark. His face didn't change much. How many are in that convoy? Minimum 6, possibly more. She looked at him steadily. Nell's initials appear in this cluster. Jonah stood. Then we can't wait. We're not waiting, Silas said. He looked at Eliza, then at his brothers. For the first time since the cabin, his shoulders were not set against them. We investigate, all of us together. I want opinions before decisions. He paused. That's a change from my usual. I'm aware. Micah opened his mouth, thought better of it, then said, should I write that down so we can hold you to it? Don't push it. Jonah was already repacking his notes into the supply bag. Eliza folded the hymn sheet and held it. The rifle shot came without warning. The bell bracket exploded. Metal rang, shrapnel pinged off the tower walls, and the cable dropped in a dead coil. Micah hit the floor. Eliza pressed herself against the cabinet. Silas was already at the door, angled back from the frame, looking out. Silence. Then Silas crouched and picked up the spent cartridge from the snow just outside the threshold. He turned it over once. His expression didn't change, but his voice, when he spoke, was different. I know this mark, he said. This casing came from Tomas Reed's rifle. Jonah stood in the doorway. Tomas Reed was with your father when he died. Yes, Silas said. He was. Tomas Reed's tracks went north. Silas found them in the snow, outside the tower boot prints, heavy-heeled, moving fast toward the tree line, and then angling up toward the ridge, where the snowpack thickened and the terrain grew unpredictable. He stood over them for a long moment, without speaking. He could have killed any of us, Micah said. He was close enough. He shot the bell, Jonah said. Not us. That's a distinction that stops mattering if the next shot goes somewhere else. Silas looked up the ridge. The sky was flat white, the kind that meant more snow before evening. Tomas Reed knew my father for 20 years. He was the last person to see him alive. He turned. I want to know why he's up here, and I want to know it before we make another move. Eliza had been quiet since the shot. She was looking at the spent cartridge. Silas had said on the supply pack, not reaching for it. Just looking. The marks on the station, she said, and the marks on the hymn sheet. Your father's map uses the same notation. She waited until Silas met her eyes. I've been trying to decide how to say this. Say it plainly. Your father wasn't just a freight man who stumbled onto something. He was building a record, a deliberate one. She held his gaze. The question I can't answer yet is whether he knew what he was recording before he started or after. Silas said nothing. He picked up his pack. We follow the trail, he said, carefully. Tomas's tracks led them northeast along the ridgeline and then dropped sharply into a narrow ravine. Eliza wouldn't have found on her own. The walls rose on both sides, stone and ice, and the snow at the bottom was undisturbed except for the boot prints. And, further ahead, the dark mouth of a tunnel entrance framed by old timber. A sign above it, barely readable, Station 7, Vale Mountain Freight. Silas stopped. His whole posture changed. My father mentioned this station once, he said. He told me it was decommissioned. Does decommissioned mean abandoned? Micah said. Or does it mean they didn't want anyone looking at it? Nobody answered that. The tunnel was 40 feet deep and opened into a hollowed chamber. It smelled of damp stone and old smoke, and something underneath those that Eliza placed. After a moment, confined space. Too many people. Too little air, over a long period. Jonah found the sleeping quarters first. He pushed open a low door off the main chamber and stood in the frame without going in. Eliza came to look 4 bunks on each wall, an iron bar across the door bracket, positioned to lock from the outside. No window, no second exit. Along the wall, beside the lowest bunk, scratched into the stone, in small, careful letters, names, dates, and between some of them, a tiny mark she recognized from the hymn sheet, the rest symbol. The ones that meant gone. She pressed her fingers lightly against one name. She didn't read it aloud. It didn't feel right to read it aloud in this place, without knowing who was listening for it. Jonah? She said. He was already crouching, looking at the floor near the door. He picked up something small and leather-bound, opened it. Inside, folded careful as origami, was a cloth patch with a faded symbol, and below it, block letters J. Calder, Army Medical. Jonah went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Dad kept a medical kit, Micah said from behind them. His voice had gone flat. He always carried it. He said it was a habit from the freight routes. Jonah set the patch down on the bunk. He stood and turned to Silas. Silas was looking at the wall of names. Eliza watched him read them. She watched the moment he understood what the rest symbols meant, and she watched him absorb it with his jaw set and his hands loose at his sides. He worked for Vale, Eliza said, quietly, not as an accusation. Silas turned. He worked freight routes. He transported goods and passengers. The word passengers came out careful. Did he know what he was transporting? Something hot moved across Silas's face. You're asking if my father knew. I'm asking because it matters for understanding what happened to him, not because I've already decided. You said passengers like it was an answer. I said it like it was a question, she said. There's a difference. Micah stepped between them, not dramatically, just moving to put himself in the space. Silas. The kit was locked in a room on the wrong side of an iron bar. He wasn't a guest. Silas looked at the door bar, looked at the kit. His jaw worked once. Then the mountain moved. The first crack came from above, a sound like a rifle shot, but longer and rolling, and Eliza had half a second to understand what it was before Silas grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the main tunnel. The ceiling of the side chamber came down in a single sliding mass, stone and ice and packed snow, and the door frame buckled inward, and then the opening was gone. Jonah and Micah had been in the main tunnel. Eliza heard Micah shout something she couldn't make out through the roaring. Then silence, sudden and total, with just the tick of settling stone. Dust and fine snow hung in the air. Silas had a hand on the wall. His lantern was still burning somehow. He held it up. They were in a pocket, maybe 12 feet of tunnel, remaining clear, with packed debris behind them, and more debris where the chamber door had been. He checked her, over with the lantern without asking, looking for blood. She let him. Then she turned and did the same to him, which seemed to catch him off guard. Your shoulder, she said. It's fine. You're bleeding through your coat. He looked down. It's not deep. He moved to the blocked end of the tunnel and pressed on the debris. It didn't shift. Jonah and Micah are on the other side. If the main tunnel held, they're clear. Eliza walked the length of the remaining space. At the far end, below a crack in the stone, she felt it a thin thread of cold air moving. There's airflow, she said, which means there's an opening. He came to look. The crack was about 2 inches wide, running diagonally from floor to midway up the wall. Below it, the stone was slightly different, less dense, older. If someone broke the mortar on the lower section, we'd need a pry tool. Eliza looked at the iron bar still attached to the half buried in debris. She pulled it free. The iron was old, but solid. Silas took it and worked the lower edge of the crack. They didn't talk much. She held the lantern where he needed it, called out when she saw the stone shift, handed him back the bar when he needed leverage from a different angle. It took 20 minutes. The crack became a gap. The gap became a passage. Cold air poured through. He looked at her in the lantern light. I'm sorry, he said, for earlier. She thought about what to say. Your father raised 3 sons in this mountain country and died trying to do something right. I don't think poorly of him. I needed the truth so I could help. She paused. That's all I was asking for. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then I'm afraid that the choices I make will cost my brothers. I've been afraid of it for years. It makes me controlling, she said. Yes, I noticed. He looked startled. Then, he almost smiled. Most people are more diplomatic about it. I'm told I lack that skill. You don't lack it. You choose not to use it. Those are different things. The gap was large enough to move through. He went first, helped her through, and they came out into open air on the north face of the ravine, 30 yards below the ridgeline. Snow was falling again. On the far side of the ravine, Jonah and Micah appeared at the tunnel mouth. Micah raised his arm. Jonah cupped his hands around his mouth. "Are you hurt?" "No," Silas called back. "Come around the south edge." It took them 10 minutes to circle. When Jonah reached Eliza, he looked her over with the same clinical thoroughness she'd seen in the cabin, checking her hands and the color of her face. She let him. "There's a body," Micah said, when they'd regrouped. His voice was even. "Down the north slope. We saw it from the tunnel exit, wearing Tomas Reed's coat." He paused. "It's not Tomas." Silas went still. "Someone dressed a dead man in his coat," Jonah said. "To make us think Tomas was dead, or to make us think Tomas was guilty," Eliza said, and then conveniently gone. They looked at each other. Back at camp that night, Silas opened the chest and gave Eliza unrestricted access to everything inside. He set it in front of her and stepped back. "All of it," he said. "Whatever helps you." She spread the maps and papers across the table. An hour later, reading a letter in her father's careful hand, she found the first real proof. He had been trying to transform Vale's hidden stations into warning points, a network for the pursued, a map of exits and safe ground. He hadn't been moving people through the mountains for Vale. He'd been learning the routes so he could offer them to someone else. She didn't say it yet. She looked up at Silas across the table, and she told him what she'd found, and she watched something in him quietly change. Then Jonah came through the door fast. His coat was gone. In its place, pinned to the door frame outside with a hunting knife, was a folded note. "Bring the woman to Raven Gorge. Come alone, Silas, or Jonah doesn't come back at all." Silas had his pack on his back in under a minute. Eliza blocked the door. She didn't do it dramatically. She just stood in front of it and held the ransom note out toward him. "Read the third line again," she said. "I've read it. Read it again." He took it. His eyes moved across the page. She watched him, counting on the fact that Silas Calder, whatever his faults, was a man who looked at evidence before acting. It was both his strongest quality and the thing that had made him insufferable in the tunnel. "It says, 'Come to Raven Gorge,'" she said. "But it doesn't say Jonah is at Raven Gorge." She turned the note over, pointed to the lower margin. A tiny mark, almost invisible, the kind left by a pen nib pressed too hard. "That's the same notation as the hymn sheet, a pitch marker." She held the note beside the sheet and aligned the marks. "This pitch corresponds to this map location." She pointed to Silas's father's map, to a relay station marked in pencil, 2 miles south of the gorge. "He's not at the gorge. He's here." Micah was looking over her shoulder. "You're sure?" "Jonah put that mark there," she said. "He knew what we were decoding. He left us instructions in the only language he had available." Micah looked at Silas. "She's right. He would. He's methodical like that." Silas set the note on the table. He pulled his pack off. He sat down and looked at the map. "All right," he said. "Tell me how we do this." She had thought it through in the 30 seconds she'd been standing at the door. She laid it out. Micah would build a mechanical distraction, something with noise and timing, pulling the guards to the wrong side of the station. She and Silas would cross the frozen river to approach from the low ground, where the relay station's back wall had no window. She would go in first, posing as a runaway they'd caught on the road. It would get her close enough to the interior before anyone raised a weapon. "You're not going in alone," Silas said. "I'm going in first. Alone is different." She met his eyes. "I can talk my way through a locked door faster than you can break it. Let me do what I'm good at." He looked at her for a long moment. "Fine," he said, "but if anything changes inside, I'll signal." She showed him her tuning fork. 3 strikes on a metal surface. "You'll hear it through the wall." Micah was already at the supply bag, pulling out a small mechanism he'd been building from salvaged clock parts for 2 days. He turned it over in his hands, adjusted something with his thumbnail. "I can get it to run for about 4 minutes, he said, loud enough to bring 3 men around the north corner. "That's enough," Eliza said. 4 minutes is enough. The river crossing was the worst of it. The ice was sound in most places, but there were dark patches near the center where the current ran fast below, and the surface was thinner than it looked. Silas went first, testing each step, and she followed in his exact footprints because he knew this river, and she didn't. Halfway across, the ice gave a low groan that moved through the soles of her boots and up her legs. Neither of them spoke. They kept moving. The relay station was a long log building set against the hillside, 2 windows on the front, a door on the south end, and the blank back wall she'd counted on. They pressed against it and waited. Micah's mechanism went off on schedule, and it was louder than she'd expected, a rapid metallic clanging that echoed off the hillside like something had come loose in the station's equipment. She heard boots on packed snow, voices, and then the sound moved around the north side. She went in the south door. The interior was dim and smelled of tobacco and wet wood. One man remained inside, seated at a table with his back to her. She pulled her coat half off her shoulder and let her hair down from its braid, and walked in like someone who had been running, and finally stopped. The man turned. She said, "Please, I left the road 3 hours ago. I don't know where I am." He stood. He was reaching for her, not his gun, which told her he'd done this before, that his first instinct with a frightened woman was to grab, not to question. She let him reach, and then she stepped aside and struck the iron door bracket with her tuning fork 3. Clear, ringing strikes. The door behind the man opened. Silas came through it. It was brief. Silas was thorough. The man sat down again on the floor, hands tied behind him with a rope from Silas's pack, before he'd fully understood what had happened. Jonah was in the back room, sitting against the wall, with his wrists bound to a wall ring. He looked up when Eliza came through the door. A bruise was forming along his left jaw. "Took you long enough," he said. "You're welcome," she said. She was already working the knot on his wrists with the piece of wire she'd kept in her hem since leaving the trapping station. He flexed his hands when they were free, checked his own fingers with a clinical eye, and stood. "The guard talked," he said. "Vale doesn't need Silas to surrender, Eliza. He needs Silas specifically because he knows these mountains. There's a new route through the North Face that none of Vale's freight men can navigate. He wants you to guide the convoy," Eliza said. "Yes." Silas appeared in the doorway. He looked at Jonah's jaw, and his own face did something controlled and careful, he said. "Can you walk?" "I've been sitting on a floor for 6 hours. I'm not injured." Jonah looked past him. "There's a man in the main room we should speak to before we leave. He's one of Vale's freight workers." He didn't look comfortable with where he'd ended up. The freight worker's name was Cal. He was younger than Micah, and he had a cut above his eyebrow that had gone untreated. Jonah looked at it without being asked, and pressed a clean cloth against it with efficient hands. Cal talked while Jonah worked. He told them that there was a woman being held at Vale's main depot, not a freight worker, not a captured runaway. A woman Vale's men treated differently, separately, with a kind of specific wariness. "She's his sister," Cal said Margaret. "She used to work the ledger system for the company. I think she figured out what the ledgers actually were." Eliza sat down. "Margaret Vale created a shorthand system," she said slowly, "for freight records. It became the notation on the hymn sheets." She looked at Jonah. "She didn't design it for this. He adapted it after. And now he's keeping her because she's the only person who can translate the full record," Jonah said. "Or because she altered something he can't read without her." Cal nodded slowly. "She changed something in the last ledger. Nobody could figure out what. Vale's been furious since October." He paused. "Your father knew her," he said, looking at Silas. "Before he died. He was trying to get her out. That's what I heard." Silas stood by the window. He didn't move. Outside, they heard Micah's low whistle, the signal that the guards were returning. They went out the back, moved fast and low along the wall, and made for the river. Silas crossed first, then Eliza, then Jonah. Eliza was 3 steps from the far bank when she heard the ice crack differently than it had before, sharper, definitive. She turned. Silas had gone through. He went in up to his chest in a single drop, arms out, hands finding the edge of the ice. The current was pulling. She could see it in how he was angling, fighting to keep his shoulders out. Jonah moved without a word. Micah was already there on the other bank, both hands on Silas's packstrap. Jonah took his arm. Eliza lay flat on the ice and grabbed the collar of his coat with both hands, distributing her weight, pulling. They got him out. He lay on the snow, breathing hard. His coat was already stiffening in the cold. Later, in the shelter of the tree line with a fire going, and Silas wrapped in every dry layer they could spare. Eliza sat close and held a cup of water near enough that he could take it when he wanted. He was shaking hard. She had seen exposure before her second year of teaching. A boy caught in a November storm, and she knew the window between fine and not fine was narrower than most people thought. Jonah was matter-of-fact and quiet and moved between checking Silas's color and feeding the fire with the calm of someone who had done this in far worse conditions. Micah sat near Silas and talked, steady, light, about nothing important. It was deliberate. Eliza recognized it as deliberate keeping Silas present, and felt mildly annoyed at the monologue, which was probably exactly the intended effect. At some point, Micah said, "I don't want her to stay, just because she needs protection anymore." He said it to the fire. He wasn't looking at anyone. Eliza was looking at her hands. "I mean that," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud while I had a reason to. That wasn't about the other things." He paused. That's all. Eliza didn't answer. She didn't look away from her hands, but she didn't move away either. And after a moment, she shifted close enough to the fire that her shoulder was almost touching his. Silas had closed his eyes. His color was better. Jonah caught Eliza's eye across the fire. He said nothing. He gave her a small nod, not agreement, not approval. Just acknowledgement. Like he'd seen something real and was recording it without judgment. Cal had followed them across the river, which none of them had planned for. He sat at the edge of the firelight, with his hands around his knees. "There's one more thing," he said. "I should have said it inside." He looked at Silas. "The convoy's moving sooner. Vale changed the schedule 2 days ago. You have less than a week." Silas opened his eyes. "And there are notices going out to Mercy Hollow. Vale's telling the town you 3 abducted a mail-order bride." Cal looked at Eliza. "He's telling them you're not right in the head, that you wandered off." He stopped. "I'm sorry. That's what the notices say." Eliza was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We need to move by morning." Nobody argued. They came into Mercy Hollow by 3 separate routes. Micah went in through the freight yard, hat low, collar up, moving like a man who had somewhere to be and had been there 100 times before. Jonah followed the creek path that ran behind the church and the livery coming out near the doctor's small house. Silas and Eliza took the road, because a man and a woman walking together drew less attention than a man walking alone in a town that had been told to look for 3 men. Eliza saw the poster before they'd cleared the first building. It was nailed to the post office wall, freshly printed, the ink still dark. A description of herself: auburn hair, gray-green eyes, slight build, and below that, 3 names: Silas, Jonah, and Micah Calder. Wanted for questioning in connection with the unlawful detainment and transport of a mail-order bride. Below the names, in larger type, the young woman may be suffering from confusion and exposure. Any information leading to her safe return will be rewarded. Contact Vale Mountain Freight. Silas read it without expression. "He printed my condition before he knew my name," Eliza said. "He knew your name. He just chose not to use it." She understood what he meant. A name made a person specific. Confusion and exposure made a person easy to dismiss. They kept walking. The town was a single main street, with a general store, a church, a small hotel, and a cluster of houses behind it. At the far end, Vale's freight depot sat wide and permanent, its sign freshly painted. In front of the hotel, 3 men in heavy coats stood in a loose group, Vale's men. She didn't look directly at them. The food shortage was visible in smaller ways. The general store's window display was sparse. 2 women outside the hotel were arguing quietly over a sack of flour. A child near the church steps sat, with her coat pulled too thin for the cold. Jonah had already found his way inside. Eliza and Silas located him in the back room of the doctor's house, which the doctor, an old man named Hess, who had apparently decided that Jonah's medical bag outweighed any obligation to Vale's notices, had offered without much fuss. 3 children were waiting, 2 with lung congestion, 1 with a foot wound gone inflamed. Jonah worked through them steadily. He used medicine he'd taken from Station 7, which he had separated from the rest of the supplies with quiet deliberateness back at camp, as if he'd always planned this. He showed the mother of the youngest child how to measure the dose by finger width in a spoon. He told the older child, who watched everything Jonah did with sharp eyes, what each item in the bag was and what it treated. Education passed through action as much as words. Eliza watched him and thought about the women who'd come west on those freight wagons, how different things might have been if any of them had known how to read a contract. Micah appeared at the back door. "The signal receiver at the far end of town," he said without preamble. "It's been dismantled. Not broken dismantled. The parts are stacked neat. Someone who knew what they were doing took it apart on purpose." "Vale?" Silas said. "Someone who knew the equipment." He sat down on a stool. "The Reverend's the only person in this town who uses that receiver besides the freight depot. Vale's men wouldn't know a signal coil from a fence post." Nobody said anything. A knock came at the front door of the doctor's house. Not Vale's knock, too hesitant for that. Dr. Hess went, came back, said there was a man outside asking for the auburn-haired woman. Tomas Reed was older than Eliza, expected 50, maybe more, with a face that had spent every one of those years in mountain weather. He stood on the back step and looked at Silas first, then at her, and he didn't reach for anything. "I've been trying to get ahead of you for 3 days," he said. "I'm not your enemy." "You shot the signal bell," Silas said, "because Vale's man was 40 yards behind me on the trail, and I needed a reason to have fired that didn't involve explaining I'd just left your camp." He looked at Silas directly. "I've been trying to protect Margaret. I've been trying for 2 years. I didn't do enough. 2 years ago or 10 years ago. I know that," he paused. "I can take Eliza out of this territory. Tonight, there's a route south of Raven Gorge that Vale's men don't know. She'd be in Missoula in 4 days." The back room went quiet. Silas looked at the floor. He was working at something. Eliza could see it, working at saying the thing he didn't want to say. "That's her decision," he said. "We won't stop her." He said it to Tomas, but he wasn't looking at Tomas when he said it. Jonah set down the bottle in his hand and looked at Eliza. "My feelings for you are genuine," he said. "I want you to understand that clearly, and they don't create any obligation you have to answer." He held her gaze. "If you want to go, go." Micah reached into his coat pocket. He set something on the table, a folded paper rectangle, creased and soft from being handled. A stagecoach ticket. Eliza's name on it. "I found it in your things when we left the trapping station," he said. "I've been carrying it so it wouldn't get lost. It's yours." He pushed it across the table. "It was always yours." She looked at the ticket. She thought about everything she'd wanted when she'd left Missouri. A city, a salary, a room with a door that locked from the inside, and a key that was only hers. Never having to calculate what she owed someone just for eating their food. She picked up the ticket. She put it in her pocket. Then she walked out the front door of the doctor's house, and she stood on the main street of Mercy Hollow, and she said, loudly enough for the people nearby to hear, "My name is Eliza Whitcomb. I came west on a fraudulent marriage contract issued by Vale Mountain Freight. I have been with the Calder brothers by my own free choice. Everything on that poster is a lie." Heads turned. Vale's men near the hotel straightened. One of the women who'd been arguing over the flour sack looked at her for a long moment. Nobody moved toward her. Nobody helped either. Vale had control of the mail routes and the freight supply and most of what the town ate through winter. Eliza understood that. Fear was a practical thing, not a moral failure. Inside later, Silas stood by the window. "Vale confiscated our stored pelts," he said. He's canceled our freight contracts and our guiding work for the season. He said it like he was reporting weather. We have no income, and we're wanted for questioning. That's where we are. You lost that because of me, Eliza said. We lost it because of Vale, Silas said. That's the correct way to state it. Micah was at the disassembled signal receiver, turning parts over in his hands. I can rebuild this, he said, given a few hours, and whoever took it apart, to tell me what they did with the coil housing. That would be me. Reverend Pike stood in the doorway. He was a small man with a face that showed every conversation he'd ever wanted to avoid. He was carrying the coil housing. He set it on the table. Vale asked me to dismantle it, he said. He told me it was being upgraded. He told me. He stopped. I suspected what he was telling me was incomplete. I dismantled the receiver anyway. I'm ashamed of that. He looked at the parts. I kept everything. I don't know if that matters. Micah picked up the coil housing and turned it over. It matters. Pike looked at Eliza. He controls the winter supply. I told myself the town needed that more than it needed. He didn't finish. More than it needed the truth, Eliza said. Yes, she looked at him for a moment. Fear makes people complicit in things they'd never choose deliberately. I know that. It doesn't make the choice right, but I understand how it happens. She paused. The question is what you do next. He nodded slowly. He left without saying anything else, which was probably the most honest response available to him. That night, after the others had settled, Eliza took out the stagecoach ticket and looked at it by firelight. It was real. The route was real. Tomas's offer was real. She folded it carefully and put it back in her pocket. She was still thinking when the explosion shook the window glass. Outside, the town storehouse was burning a thick orange column against the black sky, and running from the south side of the building, illuminated by the fire, was Micah. He hadn't said it. She was sure of that. With the same certainty, she'd been sure about other things that turned out to matter. But the men who came running out of the hotel had seen him, and by morning it would be on a new poster. Micah spent the night in the Mercy Hollow jail. It was a single room with an iron-barred front wall and a stove the deputy had let burn low. He'd asked for his coat back twice, and been refused once and ignored once. He sat on the bench, along the back wall, with his arms on his knees, and waited. Silas could not come into town. Two of Vale's men were posted at the main road with a description. Eliza and Jonah came in separately. Jonah through the alley behind the hotel, and Eliza through the church, which Pike had left unlocked. The church was where she found the hymn sheets. She wasn't looking for them. She was cutting through to reach the side street, moving fast along the wall, when she saw them on the Reverend's desk, a stack of printed pages, ordinary-looking, the kind used for choir practice. She stopped. She picked up the top sheet. The notation was different from Nell's copy. More recent, she could tell from the paper quality and the style of the printed clef marks. But the false notes were there, the wrong rests, the margin numbers. She took 3 sheets and put them inside her coat. Jonah was waiting in the alley. She showed him. He looked through them quickly, his face going through a sequence of expressions that ended on something cold and controlled. These were in the church, she said. Vale used Pike to distribute them, Jonah said. The choir practices. The music goes out to other settlements along the freight route. It looks like mission work. It's a dispatch system, Eliza said. He's been sending convoy schedules and route updates disguised as hymn distributions. She pressed her hand flat on the pages. This is how he coordinates it all. Through churches. Pike was in the side room off the vestibule. He was sitting in a chair with his hands in his lap, and he looked like a man who had been sitting in that chair for a long time working up to something. I carried them, he said when he saw what she was holding. Vale told me they were mission materials. Printed hymns for isolated settlements. He looked at the pages. I carried them for 3 years. I suspected something was wrong 18 months ago. I kept carrying them. He paused. I told myself it wasn't my business, that the freight company was helping families settle in the region, that what I didn't know couldn't make me responsible. You knew enough, Jonah said. He said it evenly, not cruelly. Yes, Pike said. I did. Jonah opened his medical bag on the pew and took out the evidence he'd assembled, the freight records from Station 7, the notation key Eliza had decoded, the altered hymn sheet from the tower. He laid them beside Pike's distribution copies. These sheets are evidence of a criminal enterprise, Jonah said. The women whose names appear in this notation are real people. Some of them are dead. He looked at the Reverend steadily. What you do with that information now is a real choice. The ones you made before those are finished. This one isn't. Pike looked at the papers for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Meanwhile, Eliza sent word to Silas through the baker's boy, who turned out to be more useful than most adults in situations that required moving unnoticed. The message was short. Jonah has proof. Hold position. Do not come into town. Silas did not hold position. He was at the church side door within the hour, and the look on his face when he came in suggested that holding position had lasted approximately as long as it took him to read the message. I said to wait, Eliza said. I came in through the Miller property. Nobody saw me. That's not the point. The point is Micah is in that jail, and I'm not standing in a field while... The point, Eliza said, is that if you walk into that jail, every accusation Vale has printed becomes evidence. You become the men who did exactly what the poster says you did. She held his eyes. We do this correctly, or we hand Vale the ending he's been planning, Jonah said, from across the room. She's right. Silas looked at his brother, then at Eliza, then at the floor. He sat down on a pew. It clearly cost him something to do it. Jonah had the explosive evidence by midday, a freight manifest from the shipment that had arrived 3 days before the storehouse fire, listing the specific compounds that Vale's depot had received. A storehouse fire required a particular combination of accelerants, and those accelerants came in on Vale's wagon. The stable hand who'd unloaded it confirmed it to Jonah privately and agreed to confirm it publicly if it came to that. They brought it to the deputy. The deputy was a young man in an uncomfortable situation, which Eliza could see in the set of his shoulders. He read the manifest carefully. He read it again. He asked 2 questions, both sensible. Then he went to the jail room, and 20 minutes later, Micah walked out. He had his coat back. Silas crossed the room and put his hand on the back of Micah's neck, briefly, the kind of grip that didn't need words. Micah looked at Eliza. Thank you, he said. Jonah got you out, she said. Jonah got me out legally. You kept Silas from getting me out in a way that would have ended badly for everyone. He paused. Both things were necessary. They gathered in the church. All 4 of them, plus Pike, Eliza, spread the decoded convoy schedule across the Reverend's desk. The convoy reaches Raven Gorge in 48 hours, she said. Margaret has been altering the code. She's been leaving markers in the route dispatches. The changes lead rescuers toward the gorge. She's been trying to redirect help to herself, Jonah said. From inside, yes. She's been doing it for months. Eliza looked at the schedule. Tomas can take me to Margaret directly. If he's telling the truth about his route, I can reach the convoy from the south approach before it reaches the bridge. You'd be alone, Silas said. I'd be with Tomas. Tomas, who we've known for 3 days. Tomas, who your father trusted. She looked at him. Silas. She stopped. She thought about how to say it. You cannot love someone while constantly taking away that person's right to choose. You know that. I've watched you know it and fight it every day since the cabin. The room went very quiet. Silas stared at the floor. Jonah spoke from the window, not looking at either of them. She's not wrong, he said, and I'm not saying it to argue with you. I'm saying it because it's true, and you need to hear it from someone other than yourself. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up, his face was stripped of whatever he usually kept in front of it. I love you, he said. He said it to Eliza, plainly, without decoration, and I'm terrified of losing you. Those 2 things have been fighting each other since the first night, and the terror keeps winning. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I've seen both. Jonah turned from the window. I want to say it plainly as well, he said. I have feelings for you that are genuine and not small, and you don't owe me an answer. I mean that exactly as I say it. There's no hidden expectation underneath it. Micah was sitting on the pew. He looked up. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than usual. I want you to see me as someone capable of handling responsibility. An adult, not a problem to be managed. He met her eyes. That's what I want from you. Not the other things yet. Just that. Eliza stood with all three of their honesty in the room around her. I have feelings, she said. For each of you, and they're different from each other, and they're all real. She paused. I cannot choose a future with any of you, or all of you, until we can meet as equals, until I have done what I came here to do, and you have let me do it, and nobody has made a decision for me in the name of keeping me safe. She looked at Silas specifically for that last part. He nodded. Once. It looked like it cost him. She left with Tomas an hour before dark. The route south was clear. The snow had stopped. Tomas moved like he knew every shadow, and he probably did. 2 hours in, he pulled up and pointed through the trees. Below them, parked in a shallow valley with 4 horses and 3 wagons, was Vale's convoy. She could see the reinforced wagon at the center iron-banded, no window. Tomas said, "He's expecting you." She looked at him. "Not me specifically," he said quickly. "He knows someone has been decoding the route. He's been waiting for someone to come." He met her eyes. Margaret said to bring whoever was reading her signs. She said, "Bring them exactly here." Eliza looked at the wagon. Tomas opened the door of the prison wagon from outside, and Vale's man at the back stepped forward, and Tomas said 3 words in a flat voice that she didn't fully catch, and then she was inside the wagon and the door closed. Dark, cold, straw on the floor. Then a voice, young, steady, trying to hold itself together, "Miss Whitcomb." "Nell," Eliza said. A pause. Then another voice older. "He brought you exactly where we needed you." Margaret Vale was not what Eliza expected. She was composed. That was the first thing. Sitting in a corner of the wagon, with her back straight, and her hands folded in her lap, as if she were waiting for a meeting to begin, rather than being transported against her will across a frozen mountain pass. Her hair was gray at the temples, and her coat was too thin for the cold, but her eyes were precise and immediate. "Tomas didn't betray you," she said before Eliza could speak. "He brought you here because this is where you needed to be. We planned it this way." Nell was pressed against the far wall, close to a girl about her own age. She was watching Eliza with a look that, mixed relief with something older than 14, had any right to be. "The route alteration worked," Margaret said. "You read it." "I read it," Eliza said. "Then you know where this convoy is supposed to go." Margaret paused. "And you know what happens at the bridge?" Eliza looked at the other women. 6 total, plus Nell and Margaret. She counted exits out of habit. There was 1 door locked from outside. A small ventilation gap at the roof seam, the floor. She crouched and pressed her palm against the boards. "How thick is this?" she asked. 3/4-inch pine, Margaret said. "They reinforced it last month. But the 4th board from the left front corner has a cracked joist underneath. The board itself isn't attached properly. Someone worked at it before we boarded in Mercy Hollow." Eliza looked at Nell, but her chin lifted slightly. "I need to cooperate with Vale long enough to alter the route again," Eliza said. "He needs someone to read the full ledger. I can give him what looks like the correct route while we redirect the convoy toward the signal tower," Margaret said. "He'll put you at the front of the wagon train. Away from us, I know. If he realizes you've altered the notation, I know." Eliza looked at all of them. Slowly, each face. "When I'm gone, you work on the floor. Quietly. When you hear 3 strikes from a metal surface, you break through." She held up her tuning fork. 3 strikes. Like this. She tapped it against the iron wheel bracket, on the wall once, twice, 3 times. Clear, ringing, distinct. Every woman in the wagon went still at the sound. Then, one by one, they nodded. Vale came to her an hour after dark. He was not the man she'd built in her mind. She'd expected something obvious: loudness, threat, immediate menace. Instead, he was pleasant, which was worse. He sat across the camp table from her, in the lead wagon, and set the ledger between them like a man sharing a business proposal. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "you're more capable than the agents who found you gave you credit for. That's my fault. I should have reviewed your file personally." She said nothing. The route through the north face. He opened the ledger and turned it toward her. "My men can't navigate it. The new trail isn't on any commercial map. Your friends, the Calder brothers, know it." He looked at her pleasantly. "Since they're not available, you'll help me reconstruct the route from the notation system." The notation system his sister had built. He said it without any particular weight. Eliza looked at the ledger. It was Margaret's shorthand, dense, precise, and altered in 3 places that she could immediately identify. Margaret had built wrong turns into the route. Small ones. Each wrong turn would cost a convoy 4 to 6 hours in mountain terrain. 4 to 6 hours per turn. 3 turns in deteriorating winter conditions. "I'll need time," Eliza said. "The notation is complex." "Of course," he smiled. "We have until morning." She worked slowly. She asked for more lantern light twice. She requested water. She studied pages she already understood and pretended to decode passages that took her seconds. Every minute she bought was a minute for Nell and the others in the back wagon. She also altered the route. Not the way Margaret had, not with wrong turns. She redirected the final approach. Instead of Raven Bridge, the notation now pointed the convoy toward the abandoned Snignal Tower Road, a trail that would bring them out above the gorge rather than on the bridge itself. She did it in the margins, in Margaret's own shorthand, and she did it small enough that Vale's men wouldn't see it, and large enough that Silas would. She thought about Silas as she wrote it. His father's map, the careful notation of someone who had been building an exit for years. She wondered if he understood yet, that she trusted him the way she trusted very few things, not blindly, not without evidence, but with the specific confidence that came from watching someone choose correctly when it was hard. She thought about Jonah, who asked before he touched and listened before he spoke. About Micah, who had handed her back a stagecoach ticket so she would have a genuine choice. She finished the false route and told Vale she was done. He studied the pages. He couldn't read them, she'd known that from the start. He needed her because the shorthand was Margaret's, and Margaret had locked herself inside a language. Only she and Eliza could navigate. He looked at the notation the way men looked at things they intended to own rather than understand. "Good," he said. "Get some rest." She was put back in the holding wagon. Not the prison wagon, a separate transport alone. One guard outside. She sat in the dark and waited. In Mercy Hollow, things were moving. Jonah stood in front of the deputy, with the stable hand, and 3 freight manifests, and the patience of a man who had argued lost cases before and won them anyway. By midnight, Micah walked out of the building the deputy had been using as a temporary magistrate office, and he had the coil housing from the signal receiver in his hands. He went directly to the church. At some point, Eliza would piece this together later from what each of them told her. Silas had stood in the center of the church with his brothers on either side and said, plainly, that he was sorry. He said he'd been making decisions for them since their father died because it had felt like the only way to keep anyone alive, and he'd let that become something else, something that was less about protecting them and more about not trusting them to protect themselves. He said it without ceremony, standing near the Reverend's desk, his voice level. Micah said, "I know," Jonah said. "I know, thank you." Then Silas said, "Eliza's plan. We follow it." Jonah said, "All of it. Even the parts where we can't see what she's doing." Micah was already working on the signal bell. Silas went to find Pike. At the church, Silas and Pike stood at the window overlooking the dark street. "If you see a signal from the mountain," Silas said, "you ring this bell. You don't wait for confirmation, you ring it," Pike said. "I'll ring it." He said it like a man making a promise to someone other than Silas. At the back of the convoy, under oilcloth and darkness, Nell worked at the cracked floor joist with a piece of wire she'd had in her boot for 6 days. She was 14, and she was precise, and she had been waiting for exactly this. The other women worked beside her in shifts, 2 at a time, applying pressure slowly enough to avoid noise. Margaret directed them in whispers, describing the joist structure from memory. She'd inspected the wagon construction herself 6 weeks ago, and cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. By the time the convoy stopped for the night, the fourth board from the left front corner was attached by one nail. Then Vale discovered the route alteration. She heard him before she saw him, his voice outside her wagon, sharp and clipped, the pleasantness entirely gone. The door opened. He stood in the frame with the ledger open in his hands. In the lantern light, his face was different. The surface had come off. "You changed the final approach," he said. She looked at him. He pulled her from the wagon and walked her to the front of the convoy, and they stopped on Raven Bridge, with the gorge below them, and the wind coming up through the gap. And he put his hand on her arm and held it, and put the other hand near the firearm at his belt. "The convoy crosses here," he said. "Correct the notation now." Below the bridge, she could see the fuse line. It ran from the south anchor post along the underside of the bridge deck. He intended to cross, cut the line loose on the far side, and let the bridge take everyone behind him. She needed 30 seconds. She struck her tuning fork against the wagon wheel. 1, 2, 3. The sound of women breaking through a wagon floor was quieter than Eliza expected, and more decisive. Vale heard it. His head turned. That half-second was what she needed. She pulled her arm hard and away, stepping back, and the firearm came out, but it came out aimed at the space where she'd been rather than where she was. Silas came over the south ridge at a run. He had timed it to the tuning fork, she would find out later. He'd been in position on the ridge for 2 hours, watching the convoy through the cold dark, and when he heard 3 clear strikes ring up from the bridge, he moved. Vale turned toward him, and Eliza stepped into Vale's gun arm, pushing it wide, and the shot went into the bridge railing, and the wood cracked and split and meant nothing. Silas hit Vale at the midsection, and they went down together, onto the bridge planks. Below the bridge, Micah was already there. He'd come down the gorge wall on a rope, not the safest approach, as Jonah had told him twice, and as Micah had agreed while already tying the rope to a larch root at the rim. The fuse was running. He'd seen the flames start from his position on the ridge and come down immediately, swinging wide over the gorge with the cold rushing up beneath him. He found the fuse line running along the underside of the center span, caught it with both hands, and pulled. It didn't cut. He hadn't brought a blade, because he'd come down a rope too fast to plan properly, which was exactly the thing Silas would have prevented if Silas had been consulted. He wrapped the fuse line around his arm and held it against the bridge timber, smothering the flame with his coat sleeve. The flame went out. His sleeve caught. He put that out too, with his bare hand against the bridge timber, which hurt considerably, and then he hung there over the gorge, holding a dead fuse and breathing hard, and said quietly, into the dark, "All right." Back on the bridge, Silas had Vale face down on the planks. He had the man's firearm in his own hand, and Vale's wrist locked behind him, and he had exactly the amount of pressure required to keep him still. He could have done more than that. Eliza watched him and knew it. The man on the planks had killed his father and built a prison out of hymn music and put a 14-year-old girl in a locked wagon. Silas had the moment and the position and the right by any measure that wasn't a courtroom. From the south side of the bridge, there was a shout, Micah's voice, not in distress, but urgent. Silas looked up. He made a choice. He left Vale where he was and ran. The bridge support on the south end had cracked when the fuse charge partially ignited before Micah smothered it. The timber had split lengthwise and was separating, and Micah's rope was tied to the larch above it, and he was hanging below it, and the whole structure was shifting. Silas went over the bridge rail. He went hand over hand, down the gorge wall on the secondary line he'd carried in his pack, the one he'd brought without explanation when they left Mercy Hollow, the one Jonah had looked at and not questioned, because Jonah understood that Silas planned for the thing he hoped wouldn't happen. He reached Micah. He got a hand under his brother's arm, and they climbed. On the bridge, Jonah had arrived with the 3 men from the signal team who'd come down from the Tower Road. He moved directly to the wounded 2 of Vale's own guards who'd been thrown when the horses panicked at the shot. He worked on them, with his bag open on the bridge planks, not asking who they worked for, not requiring them to be anything other than injured. Vale tried to stand. Jonah put his boot on Vale's wrist very calmly, without looking up from the wound he was packing. "Stay there," he said. Vale stayed there. From the tower above the gorge, Tomas had lit the fire basket. The light went up orange against the black sky, steady and high, visible down the valley. On the mountain opposite, a mirror caught it and redirected it north. Then another, then another. After that, the signal moved across the range, like something waking up, passing from station to station along a network that a freight man named Calder had designed for exactly this purpose 10 years before anyone was ready to use it. In Mercy Hollow, Pike stood at the church window. He saw the signal. He rang the bell. The first peal went out across the town, and then the second, and by the third the main street had people on it, pulling coats on, asking each other what it meant, and enough of them had heard enough from Jonah and Eliza in the last 2 days to start moving toward Raven Gorge. On the bridge, Nell climbed out of the gap in the wagon floor and stood up straight and looked around her, and did not flinch at any of it. Margaret walked to the bridge rail and stood beside the restrained Vale and looked at her brother steadily. She had the full ledger in her hands, the real one, the unaltered one, the one she'd been protecting for 2 years inside the lining of her traveling case. "I'll name them," she said. "Every business partner, every station, every route, all of it." Vale looked at her. "You built it on my work," she said. "That was your mistake. I know every part of it." Eliza stood at the center of the bridge. She held the full list of names from the ledger. Not Margaret's copy, but her own reconstruction, built over 9 days from the hymn sheets and the tower markings and the notation key. She read them aloud, one by one, in the order they appeared. Women who had been transported through these mountains. Women who had been held. Women who were still unaccounted for. She read every name. When she was done, the bridge was very quiet. Silas and Micah came up over the gorge rim. Micah's sleeve was burned, and his hands were red from the cold and the fuse, and he was moving carefully, which was how she knew he was hurt, because Micah usually moved like he hadn't noticed the ground. Jonah looked up from his work. He looked at Micah's hands and stood and crossed the bridge in 6 steps. Silas looked at Eliza across the width of the bridge. She looked back. They'd said what needed saying in the church in Mercy Hollow. She thought he understood, that she knew what his decision had cost him going over that rail for Micah instead of staying where he was. She thought he probably understood that was the thing, the specific thing that removed the last reservation she'd been carrying. Vale's remaining guards put down their rifles. Margaret had already begun speaking to them, individually telling each one what would happen if they cooperated, and what was documented if they didn't. She was methodical and clear, and she had clearly been preparing this speech for some time. Tomas came down from the tower. He didn't look at Silas directly. Silas looked at him for a long moment, then put out his hand. Tomas took it. Vale was alive. Jonah had made sure of that, which took more medical discipline than most people would have managed in his position. The man was bruised and cold and furious, and would remain alive long enough to face the people he had harmed. That was the point. Inside the signal keeper's shelter that night, with the storm moving back in off the peaks and all 4 of them crowded around a stove, the size of a wash basin, the silence was a different kind than before. Before, silence had been careful, everyone measuring what they could say. This silence was tired and warm, and knew where it stood. Micah looked at the shelter's narrow bed, and back at the room, and said, There's only one bed. Jonah said it next, quieter, with a small turn at the corner of his mouth. Silas said it last. He said it as a question. Eliza looked at all three of them. The first time I stepped inside, she said, it was because I was afraid of the men outside. She paused. This time I'm staying because I trust the three men inside completely. She told them what she felt, all of it. For each of them, different and real, and nothing she needed to choose between. She told them the terms she required: no ownership, no assumed expectations, no decision made on her behalf. Privacy was hers. Closeness was chosen. Anything could stop, they agreed, each of them in their own way. Silas was still, deliberate. He held her hands like something he was grateful for. Jonah asked if she was certain. When she said yes, he pulled her close and held there steady. Micah put his forehead against hers and laughed, soft and real. Outside, the storm moved over the shelter and kept going. In the morning, a messenger arrived from Mercy Hollow. The stagecoach for St. Louis was leaving the following day. The stagecoach driver loaded her bag without ceremony. He didn't know who she was or where she'd been. He'd tied the bag to the roof rack with the same knot he'd used on 20 other bags that week, and climbed back up to his seat and waited for the departure time. Eliza stood beside the coach on the main street of Mercy Hollow. The morning was cold and clear, the first real sun in 10 days, cutting flat across the snow. Around her, the town was moving, people going about their morning, a child crossing to the baker's, smoke from the hotel chimney. At the far end of the street, the three brothers stood together. Not in her path, not between her and the coach. They'd arrived together and positioned themselves where she could see them, and where they were clearly, visibly, not moving toward her. Vale was in the freight depot under guard, waiting for the territorial marshal, who was 2 days out. Margaret was at the doctor's house with the ledger, working through it page by page with Jonah the previous evening in a session that had lasted until past midnight. Tomas had left before dawn, heading south with a list of stations and a description of the route that still needed clearing. Nell was in the church. Eliza had looked in on her that morning before the stagecoach came. She'd found her at the Reverend's desk with a book open, running her finger under each word, mouthing it. Margaret sat beside her, not helping unless asked. "Will you stay?" Eliza had said. Nell looked up. "Margaret's going to teach me medicine," she said, "and reading. Proper reading." She paused. "Is that all right?" "It's more than all right." Now Eliza stood beside the coach with her bag on the roof and her ticket in her pocket, and the stagecoach driver looking at his watch. She thought about the city she'd planned, the room with the locked door, the salary she would earn, doing work that no one could take credit for. She thought about how much she'd wanted those things and how real that wanting had been. She thought about what she'd built instead, a school that didn't exist yet but would, a signal network that was already running, a signal tower above the valley with 4 illuminated windows and a door that stayed open. She thought about 3 men at the end of a street who had given her back every option and were now standing still in the cold, waiting, because waiting was the only thing left that respected her choice. She walked to the driver. "Remove my bag, please." He looked at her. "You sure?" "Yes." He untied it and handed it down. She carried it to where the brothers were standing. They watched her come. "I want to be clear," she said. "I'm not staying because I'm frightened. I'm not staying because I'm indebted." She looked at each of them. "I have a legitimate offer, a real one, a music teacher position in St. Louis, decent pay, a place to live." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm staying because this is the life I freely choose." Silas looked like he was working to keep his face arranged correctly. Jonah said, "All right," quietly, like a door opening. Micah said, "Good." And his voice came out rougher than he probably intended, which was its own kind of honesty. They sat at the table in the rebuilt station that evening, all 4 of them, and worked through what came next in plain terms. Eliza's name went on the property deed, equal share, legally documented, her own income from the school built into the agreement from the start, her own room, her own key, private space that belonged to her, fully, not conditionally. Jonah's clinic would run independently. He'd take no payment from patients who couldn't afford it, and the supply cost would come from a shared account that all four of them could see and question. Micah laid his plans for the rebuilt cabin on the table and spread them flat. 4 bedrooms, a large shared room at the center, storage a workshop, a schoolroom that could double as a refuge. Silas looked at the plans for a long time. Then he took a piece of paper from the desk and wrote Eliza's name at the top of the signal station documents as equal partner, signed it, and put it in front of her. She looked at it. Then she picked it up and folded it and put it in her coat in the same pocket that had held the stagecoach ticket. Jonah set a key on the table, iron, old-fashioned, on a plain ring. "Your room," he said. "You'll never be required to share it." She picked up the key. Micah pointed to the plans. 4 bedrooms, he said. "I want to officially note that. For the record, I see them," she said. "We have solved the problem," he said, "of only having 1 bed." She looked at the plans, at the 4 labeled rooms, at the wide shared space in the center that opened toward the front door. The number of beds was never why. "I stepped inside," she said. "I entered because the men outside wanted to take away my choice, and the 3 men inside opened their door without claiming me." She kissed Silas. It was honest and equal and settled. The kind of kiss that meant, "I see you clearly, and I'm here anyway." She kissed Jonah. It was tender, unhurried. He held still the way he always held, still receiving, not taking. She kissed Micah. He laughed into it just briefly, and she didn't mind. The supporting pieces fell into place over the weeks that followed. The way things do when enough people decide to do the right thing in sequence. Margaret became the record keeper for the rescue station. She cataloged everything: routes, contacts, women's names in a new notation that only she and Eliza understood, and she kept 2 copies in separate locations because she'd learned that lesson personally. Nell studied every day. Literacy first, then arithmetic, then the medical texts Jonah ordered from the territorial capital. She had a particular gift for pattern recognition that Jonah said was rare, and he said it in front of her so she could hear it, because that mattered. Tomas sent messages from the southern route. He didn't come back north, and nobody expected him to. He was doing what he could do, which was enough. Pike donated the old church building for use as a schoolroom and temporary shelter. He left Mercy Hollow shortly after, which most people agreed was appropriate. The building was more useful without him in it. Jonah's clinic saw 30 patients in the first month. He trained 2 of the women who'd been on the convoy to assist him basic wound care, medicine measurement, the specific skills that kept people alive in isolated places where a doctor was 2 days away. Micah built the avalanche warning system over the course of the winter. It was ugly and made of salvaged parts and worked perfectly. Silas guided rescue parties. Not freight trains anymore. Men and women who needed to move through the mountain country without being found by the people looking for them. Eliza opened the school. She taught reading first, then contract law. She made her students read their own documents out loud before they signed anything. She told them what to look for: contradictory dates, unsigned authorization, promises not in writing, seals that looked official without being verifiable. She taught them what she had learned. That knowledge was protection, that the most useful thing she could give anyone was the ability to recognize a lie before it became a chain. In spring, she climbed to the Black Pine Tower. The morning was clear, the snow melting off the higher peaks, the valley below green, for the first time since she'd arrived. She stood on the platform at the top and took her tuning fork from her pocket and struck it once against the iron rail. The tone went out across the valley. Below in Mercy Hollow, a bell answered. Then, from the north station, another bell. Then a third, further away, at the edge of hearing, from a station she'd never visited, but whose location she knew by the notation on a map, drawn by a man she'd never met. She stood there listening until the sound faded. Silas, Jonah, and Micah came up through the hatch behind her, one after another. They came to stand beside her on the platform, and none of them stood in front or behind. Below them, the homestead had 4 lit windows. The door was open. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Eliza is standing beside a stagecoach with her bag already loaded on the roof. The 3 brothers are at the far end of the street. None of them are walking toward her. None of them are asking her to stay. They are just standing there in the cold, giving her the one thing that actually matters, a real choice, with no strings attached. That image is the whole story in a single frame. We talk a lot about love in stories like this, but what this one is really about is something quieter and harder to find. The difference between protection and control, and how easy it is to confuse the two. Silas spent years making decisions for the people he loved and calling it taking care of them. It took Eliza, a woman who had been controlled, deceived, and transported across a mountain range, like cargo, to say the thing plainly. You cannot love someone while constantly taking away their right to choose. That line isn't romantic. It's a principle, and it's one that holds in every kind of relationship, not just the ones in fiction. The other thing this story does quietly is show us what trust actually looks like when it's being built from scratch. Eliza doesn't trust the Calder brothers because they're strong, or because they're kind, or because they give her a warm bed. She trusts them because they keep showing her, one small decision at a time, that her judgment matters. Jonah asks before he touches her hand. Micah returns her stagecoach ticket, so she keeps a real option. Silas puts her name on the deed before she's committed to anything. Trust isn't declared. It's demonstrated, repeatedly, in small moments, under pressure. That's as true in 1879 as it is right now. And then there's Eliza herself. She arrives with a torn boot, a bleeding hand, a fraudulent contract, and nothing else. She leaves having decoded a criminal network, organized a rescue, trained a signal system across a mountain range, and opened a school that teaches women how to read their own contracts. Her weapon throughout was knowledge, the ability to notice what didn't fit, to read what others couldn't, to understand a system well enough to redirect it. That's not a frontier fantasy. That's a transferable skill. The most durable protection any of us can carry is the ability to recognize a lie before it becomes a chain. Nell understood that at 14. She hid a coded hymn sheet in her boot and waited for someone who could read it. Margaret understood it, too. She built the language her brother used against people, and then she used that same language to lead rescuers to the right place. The women in this story don't wait to be saved. They create the conditions for their own rescue and then execute them. That's worth noticing. So, if there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of this story, it's this. A home is not built by the people who claim ownership of you. It's built by the people who respect your right to leave and make you want to stay anyway. This story is a work of fiction set in the American West of the 1870s. All characters, organizations, and events are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent any real persons or historical groups.